A global political and economic showdown is unfolding, one that pits the formidable former U.S. President Donald Trump against Burkina Faso's resolute leader, President Ibrahim Traoré. This is not just a dispute over trade tariffs. It is a defining moment, a signal of a shift in global power. A global political and economic showdown is unfolding, one that pits the formidable former U.S. President Donald Trump against Burkina Faso's resolute leader, President Ibrahim Traoré. For decades, smaller nations like Burkina Faso were overshadowed on the world stage. Their economies left vulnerable to policies crafted thousands of miles away. But now, under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso stands firm, challenging America's America First agenda and demanding fairness in global trade. Can Burkina Faso and the wider African continent withstand the pressure of the world's largest economy? Is President Ibrahim Traoré the strong voice Africa needs to reclaim its economic destiny? And how will the United States respond to this challenge? In early 2024, Donald Trump returned to the world stage, bringing back his nationalist economic doctrine, America First. At the center was an aggressive tariff policy, one designed to curb imports, protect jobs, and rebuild American industry. Heavy tariffs hit a wide range of imported goods, especially raw materials and farm products from developing nations. Burkina Faso, a West African nation still rebuilding from decades of colonial exploitation, found itself in the crosshairs. Exports like cotton, raw gold, shea butter, and food products faced severe restrictions. Suddenly, these goods became too costly, too unattractive for American buyers. The impact was immediate. Burkina Faso's export revenue collapsed. Government funds for roads, schools, and health slowed down. The country's fragile growth was strangled by a policy it did not create. Small farmers lost their contracts. Local industries, unable to adapt quickly, began to shut down. The ripple effects touched every corner of Burkinabe society. For the United States, this looked like a calculated step toward economic resurgence. But for countries like Burkina Faso, it felt like economic warfare. A punishment for daring to compete in a global market long dominated by the industrialized North. Yet, not everyone would accept this quietly. In the dusty corridors of Ouagadougou's government buildings, one voice grew louder, clearer, and more defiant. President Ibrahim Traoré was preparing to fight back, not only for Burkina Faso, but for the dignity of all developing nations. President Traoré did not flinch. While many in the global South accepted economic submission, he did the opposite. He launched one of the boldest counteroffensives any African leader has taken in modern history against U.S. trade dominance. His first move: go global. Traoré carried the battle straight to the highest international stages, the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. There, standing before delegates from across the world, he denounced the tariffs as modern colonialism, a tool used by the powerful against the emerging. His voice was calm yet firm. His message was unmistakable. Africa will no longer accept economic enslavement, disguised as free trade. Next, he turned inward to defend the nation's lifelines. The Burkinabe government swiftly banned high-tariff U.S. imports, industrial machinery, processed foods, luxury consumer goods. But Traoré did not stop with retaliation. He used the moment to ignite a wave of local production. Ministries coordinated with farmers, engineers, and manufacturers. Together, they replaced imports with domestic alternatives. This was not just a trade war, it was a battle for economic sovereignty. Then came the masterstroke: the creation of the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance (CESA), a regional trade bloc of African nations determined to resist Western pressure, led by Traoré. CESA quickly gained support from Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea. Their mission was clear: build an internal market strong enough to resist external control. For the first time in decades, these nations spoke with one voice on economics, on security, on self-determination. And beyond Africa, Traoré looked outward, to alternative powers: China, India, Brazil, Russia. Through quiet diplomacy and rapid deal-making, Burkina Faso secured new trade agreements that bypassed Western tariffs. These alliances brought development loans, technology deals, and infrastructure projects without the usual strings attached. At home, these moves transformed Ibrahim Traoré from a national reformer into a regional revolutionary. But one question remained. How would the West and Donald Trump respond to this rising African resistance? Trump did not wait long. In a televised address from Mar-a-Lago, the former US president did what he always does. He hit hard and loud. He labeled Ibrahim Traoré a radical déstabilisateur. He warned that Burkina Faso was becoming a hub for anti-American aggression under the cover of economic nationalism. He accused Traoré of endangering global markets, of undermining years of Western development aid in the Sahel. Trump's words echoed across US media. Commentators repeated his warnings. Headlines flashed on the screen. Burkina Faso threatens global trade stability. Is Africa turning against the West? Traoré's rebellion. A new axis of resistance. The framing was deliberate. Traoré was not painted as a reformer. He was painted as a disruptor. Behind the scenes, Washington moved quickly. Diplomats were sent across Africa, urging governments to step away from the Sahel bloc. Aid packages were reviewed. Some delayed, some frozen. Intelligence briefings grew louder. Reports pointed to Burkina Faso's growing ties with China and Russia. They hinted at rising security risks. But the clearest signal came from American think tanks and trade lobbyists. Reports now called for tighter controls on African imports, for surveillance of anti-globalist governments, for new financial tools to contain what they called the Traoré Doctrine. Traoré's moves had struck a nerve. He was not just resisting a tariff, he was challenging a global system built on Western dominance. And yet, for millions across Africa and the wider developing world, his stance was not reckless. It was righteous. Ibrahim Traoré had become something rare in modern geopolitics. A head of state, willing to risk isolation, to demand fairness. This clash between an aging empire and a rising rebellion was no longer just about economics. It had become a referendum on the future of global leadership. Inside Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré's bold stand against US tariffs did not provoke fear. It sparked transformation. His government's decisive turn toward self-reliance ignited a surge of civic pride not seen in decades. Across rural provinces and urban centers, people began to speak of real independence, not in words, but in action. Local farmers, once dependent on foreign buyers, now gained support from state-funded cooperatives. They processed and sold their goods at home and within the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance. Corn, millet, cotton, and shea butter, once undervalued by international markets, became tools of national resistance. Farmers were no longer just producers. They were patriots. Traoré's administration pushed domestic production. Tax breaks and subsidies went to entrepreneurs in farming, factories, and renewable energy. New training centers opened in Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and Kaya. They taught export logistics, trade law, and value-added production. Exporting was no longer the job of a few elites. It was becoming a national mission. Socially, his reforms gave people purpose. A population long disillusioned by foreign control now found hope. University students marched in support of Traoré. Labor unions, once skeptical, voiced approval as jobs appeared in factories and cooperatives. Even religious leaders, Muslim and Christian alike, issued joint statements. They endorsed the push for economic sovereignty. In sermons and prayer gatherings, one phrase echoed as both a blessing and a vow: Burkina Faso will rise. But with pride came pressure. Traoré knew the path he chose carried risks, from within and beyond. No revolution is without resistance. As Burkina Faso surged forward with his radical reforms, fault lines began to show, not only from outside powers, but from inside the nation's own establishment. Some high-ranking officials and former ministers, tied to foreign trade and aid, questioned his path. They warned of isolation, sanctions, and frozen credit lines. Opposition brewed quietly, in boardrooms, in back channels, among those who once profited from Western-aligned trade. Western embassies in Ouagadougou increased their presence. Closed-door meetings with opposition figures became more frequent. Government analysts suspected intelligence activity. efforts aimed at finding cracks inside Traoré's coalition. Meanwhile, foreign-funded NGOs began releasing critical reports. They spoke of authoritarianism and of economic nationalism gone too far. Their goal: reshape the story, weaken public support. At the same time, Traoré's government faced real internal risks. Inflation ticked upward as imports were disrupted. Factories struggled to meet demand. Black market traders, tied to smuggling networks, sought to exploit instability. But the greatest threat was not economic. It was psychological. Western media framed Burkina Faso as a rogue state. That story sowed doubt among some elites and business owners. For Traoré, the fight for sovereignty was not only in factories or parliaments, it was in the minds of his people. And yet, his approval soared. His speeches drew huge crowds. His call for dignity over dependency struck deep. It resonated with the poor, and with the young generation of Burkinabe, raised in poverty and foreign control. Ibrahim Traoré was reshaping what it meant to lead in the global south. But this resilience was about to be tested by greater forces beyond Africa's borders. In Washington, the lights of the Oval Office burned late. President Donald Trump, in his second term, under the slogan "Keep America First," was not backing down. Not from a challenge by a small African nation. But this time, something was different. When Ibrahim Traoré stood at the United Nations General Assembly, he named U.S. tariff policies directly. Inside the White House and the Pentagon, officials saw it not as theater, but as the spark of a new wave of resistance from the global south. For Trump, that was unacceptable. The U.S. Treasury moved quickly. Burkina Faso was placed on an economic watch list for disruptive trade practices. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative announced new measures under review, sanctions that could freeze assets of Burkinabe officials, suspensions of technology transfers, cuts to logistics support, and a halt to financial aid. A $120 million assistance package from USAID was suspended without end. Trump, never one to waste a political moment, turned the crisis into a rallying point. At a campaign-style event in Iowa, he labeled Ibrahim Traoré a radical agitator dragging Africa into chaos. He warned, "The United States will not sit idly by while rogue states undermine the global trade order we built." Fox News and other right-leaning outlets pushed stories painting Burkina Faso as reckless, a regime threatening American jobs and global stability. Traoré was portrayed as a dangerous populist, a man who must be neutralized. On the military front, the Pentagon expanded drone surveillance over the Sahel under AFRICOM. Officially, it was to monitor terrorists. Unofficially, they were watching Traoré. Any signs of weapons, Russian mercenaries, or Chinese projects were flagged. The Trump administration also pressed its allies: France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada. Each followed. A quiet but effective freeze began. Embassies scaled back in Ouagadougou. Western banks tightened controls, delaying or denying transfers. For Traoré, the squeeze was on. And yet, even as Burkina Faso was isolated, he stood firm. In the shadows of Western condemnation, new allies began to step forward. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, from the dusty borders of West Africa, a ripple of resistance was forming. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, was no longer standing alone. In South America, Brazilian President Ricardo Monteiro, known for his nationalist rhetoric, declared support. "We know what it's like to be punished for wanting sovereignty," he said in Brasilia. Trade delegations soon arrived in Ouagadougou. Talks opened on farming and energy cooperation. In Asia, India deepened ties. They offered technology support for Burkina's agriculture and digital finance. In China, state media began calling Traoré a symbol of new African dignity. His defiance of U.S. tariffs was framed as part of a wider decolonial movement. And in Russia, state-owned energy giants signed long-term deals with Burkina Faso, mining projects, infrastructure support, all bypassing U.S.-controlled financial systems. Russian military advisors quietly began helping with border defense and cybersecurity. And then came the shock. The African Union held an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. For the first time in decades, the continent spoke with one voice. The summit condemned unilateral economic aggression. It endorsed the creation of a Pan-African Economic Defense Fund to shield nations from foreign financial blackmail. Even in Europe, cracks appeared. Youth-led climate and decolonial movements in France and Belgium staged protests in solidarity with Burkina Faso. Hashtags spread online: "Stand with Burkina, Traoré's right." Riding this momentum, Traoré called a special session of the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance (CESA). 10 nations joined a pact. They pledged to cut dollar dependency, expand African trade, and accelerate industrialization. They even proposed a digital currency, Africoin, to bypass SWIFT and IMF-backed credit systems. What began as a local reaction to U.S. tariffs had snowballed into something much larger: a coordinated challenge to the global economic order, a turning of the tide in the long struggle over who controls development. For the first time in decades, an African president had not only said no to Washington, he had inspired nations to rethink their entire relationship with the West. The old tools, sanctions, pressure, isolation, were losing their power, and in this new age of multipolar defiance, the next battleground would not be only in speeches or trade. It would be ideological. It would be moral. It would be generational. In a world where superpowers long dictated the rules, Burkina Faso, a small nation in the heart of the Sahel, had become a symbol of defiance. Not with weapons, not with vast reserves, but with something far more dangerous to the old powers: an unyielding will. Donald Trump believed his tariffs would force poorer nations to bend. But he did not anticipate the rise of a young leader. A leader who could not be bought, who would not be afraid, who refused to depend. President Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré did not simply react to injustice. He built a clear strategy. He called for unity. He leveraged technology. He launched a global media campaign. And he ignited the spirit of self-reliance. More importantly, he forced the world to ask questions never asked loudly enough. Why must small nations endure an economic model imposed by the powerful? And what happens when they dare to push back? We are witnessing something rare. A global power shift not waged with guns, but with courage. Burkina Faso has chosen the hard path. Yet it is this path that inspires millions. From Lagos to Lima, from Jakarta to Johannesburg, to stand up and to reclaim their economic destinies. If you believe the world is ready for a new order, where small countries carry weight, where fairness is not a privilege but a right, please share this story. Let Burkina Faso's voice be heard far and wide, and never underestimate the power of a small nation, led by a leader who refuses to bow. Let us begin with a prayer for Africa, a continent rich in history, culture, and resilience. We pray for peace to blanket Burkina Faso, and all nations striving for dignity and self-determination. May the people find strength in hardship, courage in adversity, and hope that never fades. We ask for divine guidance for President Ibrahim Traoré, a leader carrying the dreams of his people on his shoulders. May his decisions be wise, his spirit unbreakable, his vision clear, as he leads Burkina Faso towards sovereignty and true freedom. In this critical moment, may Africa rise, not only with its resources, but with the strength of its people united. To you, our viewers, we say, this is more than a story. It is history in the making. It is a call to witness. If you believe in Africa's awakening, if you believe in leaders who stand for justice, and if you want to join a community that seeks truth beyond the headlines, we invite you to subscribe. By subscribing, you join a movement that refuses to look away, a movement that embraces both the struggles and the victories of a continent rising. Your subscription is not just a click, it is a commitment to awareness, to solidarity, to hope. Together, let us watch closely, listen deeply, and support boldly. Because when Africa rises, the world changes.